On today's episode, we'll be talking about A Paranormal Camping Trip, a Dogman-like Creature, and much more. All coming up on this edition of Midweek Mysteries. Welcome to the show, and thank you for joining me. As always, I am your host, Nick Ryan. And before we start, I'd like to thank all of you for joining me and for supporting the podcast. If you enjoy the show, please remember to subscribe, share, and review the podcast. This supports us by helping new listeners to discover the show. And if you'd like to support us even further by becoming a patron or by donating, please visit us at patreon.com/paranormalmysteries or at buymeacoffee.com/paranormal. These links and others can be found in the show notes. And if you've encountered the paranormal and would like to share your story, please email me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com. All experiences, no matter how big or small, are always welcome. And with that in mind, our first midweek mystery comes from That GI on Reddit, and their story is called My Experience in the Forest of Ontario. That GI says, "This is the first time I've ever told this story to anyone other than a few of my close friends. I would just like to hear if anyone has experienced anything similar. I found some photos for proof, and I may be able to track more down when I go home for the holidays. I grew up in a rural community in southern Ontario, and it was one of those places where everyone wears camo, and when deer hunting opens, everything becomes deserted. As a kid, I spent the majority of my time in my forest playing alone, as my sisters weren't too fond of leaving the house, and my closest friend lived a few kilometers away. My favorite pastime was finding anything that I could hit things with a stick, an axe, or a hockey stick, and just run around the woods for hours, practicing my combat skills against the defenseless trees. Every day, my bus would drop me off at around 2:55 p.m., giving me lots of time to defeat my wooden enemies, before my parents returned around 5:30 p.m. And once it was summer, I was out there from the moment I woke up. But I was always sure to be back and in the house before my parents got home, so they couldn't catch me messing about with a splitting axe. This was my nightly routine, from about age 9 to 13. By around age 13, the act started to get boring. I knew my forest like the back of my hand, and finally I had worked hard enough to buy an Xbox. One summer day, the internet went out, ruining my game of Medal of Honor, so I decided to do the one thing I had done a million times before, and go and get lost in my forest. It was probably around 10 or 10:30 a.m., so I knew I had plenty of time before my dad came home. This being southern Ontario, the only thing that I was remotely scared of were fishers. Combined with the fact that I was no longer interested in fighting the trees, I only brought with me my fancy pocket knife, which I had kidnapped from my father's police cruiser. I ran into my forest, up the main path and over a ridge I had scaled many times before. I was gone probably 20 minutes when things started to feel strange. For some odd reason, I felt as though I was being watched. I had never seen anyone but my neighbor in my forest before, so I immediately tossed the idea aside, thinking that I was just being overreactive. I kept running or walking for about another 10 minutes when the feeling started to get much stronger. I suddenly felt as though I was somewhere that I shouldn't be, as though the branches overhead started to get thicker and everything got much darker and much quieter. Occasionally I would hear this strange sound. It wasn't like any animal I'd heard before, but more like the bell on a bike, with an odd echo to it, almost like a metallic cricket. I decided that I should probably head home, and I checked the time on my phone, and it said that it was 11 a.m. It was then that I realized that I had no idea where I was. Keep in mind that I knew every inch of this forest, from the roads that border three sides to the lake that borders the other, and I had hiked every inch of it numerous times before. Yet I had no idea where I was. And then things started to get stranger. I looked down around my feet and saw a bunch of metal buckets and various metal tools, and this is when I heard a voice. It seemed like a child calling for me by name. The voice was light and seemed to flow effortlessly on the wind. In my panic, I assumed it was one of my sisters calling me to come home, So naturally, I called my sister's name back. When I got no response, I took my phone out and tried calling, but this being the middle of nowhere on the Canadian Shield, I had no service. I looked around, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw something dart behind a tree. I looked around me and saw laying in the ground among the buckets a rusted red bicycle, and it looked like something from the 50s that you'd see in anti-nuke posters. And the bike seemed to be in the one part of the forest that light was shining through, kind of staging it. I quickly opened my camera and took a photo, thinking that my eyes were playing tricks on me. I then heard it again, but by this time the child sounded like they were almost singing my name, breaking it up at the syllables. I started to quickly walk away, hoping that I would end up anywhere but this area, but the voice seemed to follow me, and I kept seeing glimpses of something running behind the trees that was keeping pace with me. So naturally, I started to run as fast as I could. I ran as quickly as my legs could manage, not caring for the branches that would whip me in my face and eyes. After about 15 minutes of running, things started to look familiar. I ran down a massive hill, and the trees started to become more open and brighter. I slowed down and started to walk, too terrified to check behind me. Once the feeling of impending doom settled, I finally mustered the strength to turn around, and the moment I turned around is a moment I will never forget. I turned behind me, and through the trees, I saw my house, as if I had been running away from it the entire time. Thinking that I must have just gotten turned around, and absolutely hating the idea of running back into the forest, I walked towards the house. As I was probably 100 meters from my house, I heard a spine-chilling shriek come from the forest behind me, similar to the sound of a mountain lion screaming, or raccoons fighting. But it was far louder and seemed to be coming from not just one place, but almost many places at once. I sprinted the final steps to my house and did not turn back, and as soon as I entered the house, I came face to face with my father, who was sitting at the kitchen table. I looked at the clock on the wall and saw that it was now 4:45 p.m. I have no idea what happened in the 5 hours between the time the photo was taken and the time that I got home. All I remember is the 30 minutes it took me to get in, and around 20 minutes it took me to get out. I went right to my room and stared at the photo on my phone, assuring myself that it had happened, and I had seen what I had seen. This was almost 5 years ago, and I still find myself looking at the photo to show myself that it really happened, and I didn't just go mad. After that day, I decided I would never venture into the forest alone, and started a new character on Skyrim to assure that I wouldn't want to go outside, even if the internet was down. My parents moved out of that house this past summer and into the city. I still love going outside, and I even found myself working in an isolation camp in the middle of the Rockies this past summer. Yet, I cannot go alone or outside the calling range of a friend. I have no idea what occurred that summer day, and nothing paranormal has ever happened to me, before or since that date. The picture that GI took of the strange area in the woods and the bike can be found in their post on Reddit via the link in the show notes, and on our forum. Our next story of the night comes from Cassandra. Cassandra's story is called Bigfoot Peed on My Tent. Cassandra says, "You've shared a couple of my encounters, for which I'm truly humbled and honored. After a conversation with my family last night, I was reminded of another story I thought you might be interested in. I'll try to keep it short, as I know that you get many tales sent to you. My daughter and I love to go camping. We found a little slice of heaven here in central Utah, one that's a well-guarded secret from those that would exploit it. The lake sits in a dormant volcano, with some areas speculated to be more than 400 feet deep. Official records listed at 175 feet, though those who have gone diving in that water would argue that statement. There are underground channels that spill out to another lake further south, which provide the plentiful fish means of travel between the two. The lake is surrounded on the west side by beautiful aspen trees, and on the east side by ancient pines. The dense forest and steep mountainside on the east side make camping there impossible, so everything is located on the west. There's a beautiful marina on the north side of the lake, with an extremely friendly owner who remembers those that return from year to year. It also has an RV park for people that like to spend their summers there, and in the fall, provides excellent space for those that like to go hunting. This particular camping trip was in mid-June in 2009, and my daughter and I were excited to spend the weekend in the most beautiful place that we'd seen. We pitched our tent, bought wood for the fire, and went to the marina to grab a bite to eat, some ice for the cooler, and extra tackle. We were eager to get up and do some fishing, so we went to bed shortly after sundown. The moon was full, with no clouds in sight, and it was truly magical. I was awakened by a really foul stench around 2 a.m. and peered out of the little window of our tent. It was difficult to see where the smell was coming from, as whatever it was stood directly in front of it. Then, out of nowhere, came the sound of water pouring on our tent. But the smell assured me that it wasn't water, and I was quite angry that our tent was being peed on by some unseen creature. At first, I thought it was a black bear, or potentially an elk, as both have a heavy presence in the area. When I got up the next morning, however, I was dumbfounded to see the largest set of footprints that I'd ever laid eyes on, walking around our tent. They were nearly 2 feet long, and almost a foot wide. The left foot appeared to be missing the pinky toe, as there wasn't a print of it. The right foot was normal, and they both stood at the side of our tent before walking off. I woke my daughter right away and showed her the tracks, which freaked us both out a bit. I had an ancient flip phone with no camera capabilities, so I wasn't able to take any pictures. I was skeptical about the existence of Bigfoot, but a small part of me wanted the adorable creature from Harry and the Hendersons to be real. There was no doubt in my mind that those tracks were from a Sasquatch, but why it decided to pee on our tent is a mystery. But after speaking with the foremost authority on Bigfoot, Dr. Jeff Meldrum, I learned that this was actually a common occurrence. I gave him the information, as well as my own contact information, and left it at that. He contacted me sometime later to say that he'd found and made several casts of prints from the surrounding area, and he thanked me for my information. While it was rather unnerving at the time, I haven't personally heard of anyone getting peed on by Sasquatch, and it's an experience I will never forget. Thanks for being awesome and providing a place for us to share our experiences with others. I'd be interested to know if any of your other listeners have had a similar experience, as it's truly remarkable and bizarre. Love from my daughter and I, Cassandra. Our next listener story comes to us from Jessica. Jessica recently shared a story in episode 123 of witnessing what is believed to be a Wendigo, and is planning on returning to the area in the future to investigate further. Since writing in with the first story, Jessica has shared another experience, and says this. This experience is about a Dogman creature that I still have no idea what it was. I used to have a friend named Haley that I had met through a mutual friend. In my previous experience I shared, I told you that I lived in southeastern Wisconsin, and Haley lived near me. I was driving out to pick her up for the weekend and to bring her back. I was just north of Como, Wisconsin, and it was around 7:30 or 8 p.m. I'm on the highway fiddling with my radio as I light a cigarette when I hit something head-on. I slammed on the brakes and steered myself to the side of the road, assuming that it was a deer. I take a deep drag from my cigarette and try to calm myself down as I get out of the car. I'm a huge animal lover, and I get really upset seeing animals hit by cars, especially if I hit anything. I even brake for small birds. Ready to pull this deer off the road, I turn my flashlight app on my phone on and start looking for the deer, and it wasn't on the road anywhere. Assuming that it may have limped off the road, I walk over past the shoulder and shine my flashlight around looking for it. I was then met with 2 big eyes, illuminated by my flashlight. It almost looked like a greyhound due to the skinny look of it, but with a larger, more rounded head, large eyes with a smaller muzzle, and almost human-like hands, which were kind of like paws. I can't really describe them because I didn't fully see them for more than a minute or so. It was crouched down in the taller uncut grass in the brush, and I was just kind of dumbfounded, trying to get my brain to catch up with what I was seeing. It was kind of whining and growling at the same time, but it didn't sound like a dog. Already reeling from the collision, I felt kind of overwhelmed, thinking that maybe this was just a weird-looking breed of dog, and that I probably hit someone's dog. I went back to the car and grabbed the sandwich that I had packed for Haley. I turned around to toss it to the creature, and whatever it was gone. Now every time I drive at night, I think about it. I'd also like to add that where I was on that highway was not very far away from Elkhorn, Wisconsin, which is home to the Beast of Bray Road. Thank you for taking the time to read this, and I apologize for the length. Your podcast is a godsend for me and really helps me to make sense of some of the paranormal that I've experienced. It also helps me to not feel so alone. Forever grateful, Jessica. Our next story of the night comes from Jenna, and Jenna's story is called Paranormal Camping Experience. Jenna says, "Hello, Nick. I have an interesting paranormal experience to share with you from Vancouver Island, Canada. Back in 2009, my boyfriend, our 2-year-old daughter, and I decided to go camping. It was still early in the year, so we knew that we were likely to have the entire place to ourselves. We packed up the truck and camper and then headed out on a long drive up island with no particular destination in mind, just a general area. North Vancouver Island is mostly dense forest and quite secluded. We eventually decided on a location, and for about 2 or 3 hours of the drive, we were out of cell service, driving down gravel roads until we got to the lake. We were correct about having the entire place to ourselves, so we figured we would set up camp on the public beach spot instead of the designated campsites. But before we did, I suggested that we go and look at the sites to make sure that we got the best spot. One site was right on the lake, so I asked my boyfriend to drive into it so we could take a closer look. As I got out of the vehicle, I noticed a memorial located on the site. It read, "Name of person died here, presumably drowned." So we decided to head back to our original spot. We drove a long ways to get to the lake, so by the time we were setting up, it was about 10 p.m. and dark. We decided to focus on making a fire to roast a few hot dogs and then call it a night. Our daughter seemed to be very anxious the moment that we got out of the truck, and she would hardly let her dad put her down and insisted that he hold her most of the time. I wandered down to the water by myself while they made a fire and just stood there for a few minutes, noticing the clouds parting and the moon becoming visible. Once I returned to the fire and began roasting a hot dog, I asked my boyfriend if he could hear the noise over the mountains. He replied that it must have been a plane, and I remember thinking that it was odd that a plane would be all that way out at that hour, but I shrugged it off. After about an hour or so, with our daughter becoming increasingly anxious, we started to hear a noise coming from the direction of the lake. It sounded like someone splashing around, so my logical senses told me that it must be a large animal walking through the stream by the lake or shore. I'm quite intuitive, and my instincts told me to just ignore it, but my boyfriend was becoming quite paranoid and couldn't stop pointing out that it was going on. After a few minutes, I noticed that the sound seemed to get louder and felt closer, so I figured that we'd best take a flashlight and check to make sure that there wasn't a bear or something coming too close. We shined the light over to the area I figured it must be coming from, but there was nothing there. I told my boyfriend that it sounded like someone struggling to swim, and at one point my boyfriend thought that he had seen something in the lake. But I was still trying to be logical, thinking that it had to be an animal near the shore, so I made him shine the light back in that direction. Now, I've always been a believer in ghosts, spirits, etc. So when I said, "Well, you know that guy drowned here," my boyfriend got scared and said, "Do not say that." I then started to notice that the splashing sounded like it was being played on a loop. We would hear the splashing, then silence for a few minutes, and then it would start up again. I too began to get scared when I noticed that it was not only getting louder, but it felt as if it was getting closer. We shined the light all over the lake for as far as we could see, and there was no one out there. We looked at the camper and thought about just climbing in, but at this point I was feeling scared because I felt like the ominous presence had gotten closer to us. I said, "Should we just leave?" I could tell by his response that he wanted to, but he didn't want to be the one to say it. So we did. We quickly gathered our stuff, jumped in the truck, and drove off. Once we got back into service, I looked up the name of the man on my phone. It turns out he had gone down in a float plane accident and was presumed to have drowned because they were never able to recover his body. We talked about it for most of the drive back, and I figured that we must have somehow experienced his final moments. Now, I'm also into astrology, moon phases, etc., and for some reason I looked up the moon phase from the day his plane went down, and it was the same as the night that we were there. His name is William Brian Sylvester. I wasn't sure if I should include his name out of respect for the family. I'll include some screenshots as well. I love your podcast, and thanks for taking the time to read my story. Jenna. According to archives, on September 4th, 1968, William Brian Sylvester was piloting a float plane, which apparently crashed during takeoff. William Brian Sylvester went missing while trying to swim to shore following the failed takeoff. I have posted the screenshots that Jenna included on our forum. As tonight's edition of Midweek Mysteries comes to an end, I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in, and a special thank you goes out to that GI on Reddit, Cassandra, Jessica, and Jenna for sharing their experiences. If you've witnessed something that you can't explain, please contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit us at paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. All of our contact information can be found in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a safe and healthy rest of the week, and we'll see you back here on Friday with our next episode. From everyone at Paranormal Mysteries, thank you for listening, and please remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.